Imagine the pitch black, just freezing expanse of the Tombigbee River in the dead of winter. It's 1858.
Right.
And the river has violently breached its banks,
Yeah.
just bleeding out into these dark skeletal trees of the Alabama swamps.
It's a terrifying image, just absolute suffocating darkness.
Exactly. And the only sounds echoing through that darkness are like the howling of a bitter north wind, the deafening roar of a massive inferno, and the desperate cries of people freezing to death in the branches above this dark, icy abyss.
Yeah, and it's a profoundly unsettling auditory landscape, right?
Yeah.
But every single element you just described is actually historical fact.
Which is wild, because today on this deep dive, we are stripping away that, that romance of the 19th century riverboat era to look at something truly horrific.
We really are. We're looking at the deadliest maritime disaster in the history of the Tombigbee River, the loss of the Eliza Battle.
Right, and we're going to basically reconstruct this nightmare minute by minute. We want to figure out how a luxurious floating palace transformed into literally a runaway death trap.
And we'll get into the impossible choices those passengers faced. That harrowing 36-hour wait for rescue in a freezing swamp. And really the profound psychological scar this left on the whole region.
Because, when we hear maritime disaster, our minds instinctively go to the open ocean, right?
Yeah.
Like the vast Atlantic, rogue waves, that sort of thing.
Oh, absolutely. The Titanic, things like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We don't naturally equate profound maritime horror with, a winding river in Alabama.
But an overflowing, freezing river at night, one that's just swallowed the surrounding forest, that presents a very specific, almost claustrophobic kind of terror.
It really does.
Yeah.
When the banks simply disappear into an infinite swamp, that environment feels just as vast and, just as lethal as any ocean.
It does. And to understand the absolute horror of her end, we kind of have to look at the grandeur of her life first.
Yeah, set the stage for us. What was the Eliza Battle?
So she wasn't just some standard working boat. She was built in New Albany, Indiana in 1852, and she was this massive wooden-hulled, side-wheeled paddle steamer. We're talking 316 tons. To put that engineering into perspective, it's this huge, multi-tiered wooden structure powered by giant steam boilers feeding massive paddle wheels on either side.
Operated by Cox, Brainerd and Company, if I remember correctly?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And her primary route involved carrying cargo and passengers between Columbus, Mississippi and Mobile, Alabama. And all the contemporary accounts, they lean really heavily on one word, which is luxury.
Right. Observer Charles Mackey described her as an elegant steamer, a floating palace.
A floating palace. In April of 1854, she actually hosted a formal reception for former U.S. President Millard Fillmore right there in Mobile Bay.
Oh, wow. So a passenger boarding this vessel is literally stepping onto a ship built for heads of state.
Exactly. They are encountering fine dining, polished mahogany, brass fixtures. You've got carpeted saloons and these warm, enclosed cabins.
It's basically the absolute pinnacle of 1850s comfort.
It is. And there's this immense psychological contrast at play here, that dictates how people behave when a crisis hits.
How so?
Well, the Eliza Battle was this space of ultimate civilization and refinement, right? But it's floating directly over an untamed, lethal wilderness.
Oh, I see. So it's that false sense of security.
Precisely. That security is vital to understanding the shock of the disaster later on. Passengers feel invincible inside a structure that opulent.
But the physical reality of the design tells a totally different story. 316 tons of wood and dense cargo against a strong river current.
Right. Moving that requires immense power. That means massive, high-pressure boilers and continuous roaring fires housed inside what is essentially just a sprawling, floating wooden labyrinth.
Which honestly brings up a detail that feels almost ominous. Before the final disaster, the Eliza Battle actually had a pretty wild history of accidents.
She did. The sources mentioned previous fires breaking out on board and several instances of just running aground.
Yeah, and some people frame this as a doomed ship,
Yeah.
A vessel where destiny simply caught up with her. You hear that cursed ship language a lot in maritime folklore.
You really do. We constantly apply the concept of destiny to mechanical failures. Calling a ship cursed is, well, it's a human coping mechanism. It shifts the blame to the supernatural.
Right, instead of looking at the actual operations.
Exactly. If we look at those early fires and groundings through the lens of, say, systemic negligence, we see the anatomy of a disaster building over years.
So you're saying these near misses were warning signs that management ignored because she was making them so much money?
That's the question, right? Was it a fatal design flaw or careless procedures?
I mean, I have to push back a little on the framing of systemic negligence, though. Is it actually negligence, or is it just the brutal law of averages for 1850s steam travel?
How do you mean?
Well, if you are steering a giant wooden mansion filled with literal open furnaces down a narrow, winding, snag-filled river every single day,
Yeah.
aren't near misses just baked into the daily operation?
That's a fair point.
Like, the sheer physics of putting a roaring fire inside a wooden hull means your margin of safety is always hovering somewhere near zero, right?
I get that, but I disagree that it's purely the law of averages. Yes, steam travel was inherently dangerous, but the response to that danger is what defines the negligence.
Okay, that's fair.
They survived the previous fires, they survived running aground, so psychologically their threshold for alarm just moved higher. They normalized the deviance.
The normalization of deviance. So they stopped treating a stray spark as an emergency and started treating it as just like an annoyance.
Exactly. That complacency is the fertile ground where this specific tragedy takes root.
So this illusion of invincibility is about to collide with the very real, very geographic reality of an Alabama winter.
Right.
Let's follow the Eliza Battle as she loads up for what should have been, a routine, albeit highly challenging, rundown river.
So it's late February 1858. The vessel is commanded by Captain S. Graham Stone, and the crucial role of pilot, the guy actually navigating the hazards, is held by Daniel Epps.
And the route from Mobile up to Columbus, Mississippi wasn't actually accessible year-round, right? Not for a ship this heavy.
No, not at all. She could only reach Columbus during the winter months, when the Tombigbee River regularly flooded and the water levels were high enough to handle her bulk.
Which, crazy to think about.
Yeah.
The very environmental condition that makes the trip physically possible, the flooded river, is the exact condition that makes it so incredibly dangerous.
Because a flooded river is a fundamentally different navigational environment than a normal river, When the Tombigbee flooded that winter, it didn't just get deeper.
Right, it's spilled out over the levees.
Spilled out and pushed deep into the surrounding ancient forests and swamps. The natural boundaries of the river just vanish.
So instead of a clear channel, Pilot Epps is basically navigating this massive, dark body of unpredictable water that bleeds seamlessly into the tree line.
Yes, the currents become erratic. Massive submerged tree trunks are swept into the channel, and all those visual markers a pilot relies on, they're completely gone under the floodwaters.
And yet, Captain Stone and Pilot Epps bring her downriver in these conditions. They're making stops at Pickensville, Gainesville, Demopolis, collecting cargo and passengers.
And by the time she leaves Demopolis on February 28th, they've got roughly 60 passengers and 45 crew members.
And crucially, she has taken on the cargo that will basically seal her fate. Over 1,200, some sources say up to 1,300 bales of cotton.
Let's analyze the specific threat of that cargo, because we aren't talking about soft little cotton balls here.
No, in 1858, cotton bales were massive, tightly compressed blocks bound by iron ties or rope.
Right. They were heavy, dense, and they were stacked high along the main decks. Not tucked away in a sealed hold, but literally creating physical walls of cargo surrounding the main deck.
Anyone who knows the thermodynamics of raw, tightly packed cotton knows that 1,200 blocks of it is basically 1,200 blocks of highly reactive fuel.
Yes. When raw cotton is compressed like that, it becomes the absolute perfect medium for a localized inferno.
It's dense enough to sustain a really hot, prolonged burn, but the fibrous outside acts like a wick, catching a spark instantly.
And consider where it's placed. This immense fuel load is on the open decks, surrounding the passenger cabins, directly beneath the towering smokestacks of the ship's own steam engines.
It's exposed to the open air. So the baseline for disaster is firmly established here. You've got a massive wooden vessel, totally surrounded by dense, flammable fuel, navigating a boundaryless flood in the pitch black.
It's a terrifying setup.
And the families sleeping in those opulent cabins are completely oblivious to this razor-thin wire they're walking on. And then that wire snaps.
Because of an extreme atmospheric shift, on the night of February 28th, going into the early morning of March 1st, this violent weather system pushes down the valley.
A really strong north wind starts howling.
And the meteorological data from the sources points to a staggering phenomenon. The temperature plunges 40 degrees Fahrenheit within just 2 hours after nightfall.
Wait, a 40-degree drop in 2 hours?
2 hours?
That is an atmospheric shock. The wind howling through the open sections of those wooden decks would have driven absolutely everyone, passengers, off-duty crew, deep into their cabins.
Oh, absolutely. They sealed their doors against the draft, totally isolating themselves from the outside decks.
Which creates this fatal operational blind spot. because with the decks cleared of shivering deckhands, there are literally no eyes on the cargo.
None. And into that completely unmonitored environment sails another steamer. At roughly 1:00 a.m., the Eliza Battle encounters a vessel heading upriver, a steamer called the Warrior.
Imagine that visual. Two massive steam-powered leviathans passing each other in a narrow, flooded channel in the dead of winter.
The churning of the paddle wheels, the glow of the boiler fires, thick black smoke pouring from the stacks into a gale-force wind.
And as the Warrior passes, sparks from her smokestacks are caught by that violent north wind. They're blown directly across the water, landing squarely among the 1,200 bales of cotton on the Eliza Battle.
And this brings up a really terrifying point about the timeline. The sparks land at approximately 1:00 a.m., but the fire is not discovered by the crew until roughly 2:00 a.m.
So there is a full, agonizing 1-hour gap where nobody knows what's happening.
A full hour.
The mechanics of how a fire burns unseen for an hour on a deck full of cotton comes down to the density of the bales we talked about. A spark landing on a packed bale doesn't instantly burst into a giant flame.
Right, it burrows, it smolders, it burns its way inward, kind of eating into the core of the bale.
It's this insidious chemical process. The outside of the bale might just show a tiny wisp of smoke, completely masked by the darkness and the ship's own smoke.
Exactly. But inside the bale, a localized oven effect is happening. And all the while, that howling north wind is acting like a massive bellows, driving oxygen into that smoldering core.
Just quietly building an inferno right outside the sleeping passenger's door. But, I mean, a smart listener is probably asking the obvious question here. If you are the crew of a steamboat in 1858 and you pass another ship belching out sparks in a gale-force wind, why isn't a dedicated watchman standing over the 1,200 bales of highly flammable cargo?
It definitely defies modern safety logic.
It's like carrying an open container of gasoline next to a fireworks display and just going to sleep.
It brings us right back to the normalization of deviance. Steamboats passed each other every night. Sparks flew continuously. Small fires were such an accepted hazard that deckhands just kept buckets of water nearby to casually douse them.
Wow. So posting a watchman purely to stare at the cotton in a freezing 40-degree temperature drop just seemed excessive to them.
Exactly. They'd survived 100 similar passes. They relied on their past luck, totally failing to realize that the wind, the temperature, and the burrowing nature of the spark had created this unprecedented variable.
So that silent hour finally ends at 2 a.m. The Eliza Battle is roughly 32 miles downriver from Demopolis, near Beckley's Landing, and the smoldering core of the cotton finally reaches critical mass.
It breaches the surface of the bales, the fire hits the open air.
And the moment the flames are exposed to that violent north wind, it just explodes.
It doesn't spread. It flashes across the stacks of cotton, leaping from bale to bale with terrifying speed. Within minutes, the main deck is a roaring wall of fire.
And the physical layout of the ship instantly turns against the passengers. Right. Because the flames completely cut off all access to the ship's lifeboat.
They do. The psychological shock of that moment is absolute. Put yourself in their shoes. You are jolted awake in the dead of night by the roar of the fire and people screaming.
You scramble out of bed, open your cabin door, and the world outside is fully engulfed.
And you are in thin nightclothes. The air hitting you is violently freezing, yet the heat radiating from the deck is blistering.
And within seconds, you realize the lifeboat is inaccessible. The safety net is gone before you even fully process the threat.
And the panic is compounded by a catastrophic mechanical failure. As the fire consumes the main deck, it reaches the steering mechanisms.
Oh, no.
Yeah. In 1850s steamboats, the pilot house sat high atop the vessel, but it was connected to the rudder at the stern via long tiller ropes. And these ropes often ran exposed along the upper decks.
So when those ropes burn through, the pilot wheel just spins freely, the rudder swings loose, Pilot F loses all steering control.
The Eliza Battle is now careening down the flooded, snag-filled river, completely blind and entirely out of control, driven only by the current and the gale-force wind.
The sensory overload of that environment, it would induce pure trauma. The wooden deck heating up under barefoot passengers, the deafening roar of wind and fire.
The popping of burning timber and 1,200 bales of cotton sounding like artillery fire.
And the blinding light of the flames casting these chaotic shadows against the pitch-black river and the dark tree line rushing past.
Which forces an impossible ultimatum on every single person aboard. They cannot stay on the ship. It's a furnace.
Right. It's a literal manifestation of out of the frying pan into the fire, except it's into the freezer. You either burn alive on the deck or you jump into dark, churning water that is so cold it will kill you in minutes.
When faced with a choice between two guaranteed agonies, the primal survival instinct overrides logic. The fire is immediate, searing pain. The water is an abstract darkness.
So the brain involuntarily chooses the darkness to escape the heat, and passengers begin leaping from the burning decks into the freezing river.
Meanwhile, up in the pilot house, Pilot Epps realizes the ship is lost. His sole imperative is to arrest the runaway momentum of this blazing hull just to give the passengers any chance of escape.
He wants to run the Eliza Battle aground.
Yes. In a normal river scenario, you angle the disabled ship toward the bank, drive the bow into the mud, and let the passengers step off onto solid earth.
But the Tombigbee is heavily flooded. The water has breached the bank by miles in some places. There is no solid earth to hit.
Exactly. Epps is staring out at an endless expanse of rushing water weaving through the massive trunks of an ancient swamp forest.
With the fire licking at the wheelhouse and his steering completely gone, he uses whatever primitive control he has left, maybe manipulating the side wheels independently or just letting the wind drive her, and he intentionally aims the 316-ton burning steamer directly into the flooded forest.
It is a staggering physical event. A multi-story luxury liner completely engulfed in flames, leaving the main channel and crashing violently through the dense canopy of a flooded swamp.
Think about the physics of that impact, the concussive force, the deafening sound of an enormous wooden hull splintering against massive tree trunks.
Giant branches snapping and collapsing onto the burning decks, the iron paddle wheels screaming and warping as they jam into submerged timber.
It sounds like absolute madness to crash a ship into a forest, but it was actually the only logical move left-right. It's like an airplane pilot aiming for a rough mountain ridge because the alternative is a vertical nosedive.
It's a violent, destructive crash, but the trees absorb the kinetic energy. Was it a calculated maneuver by Epps, or just the blind luck of a desperate man drifting into a thicket?
Given his experience, I argue he understood the geometry of the flood. He knew the banks were gone. He used the flooded forest as a makeshift brake pad and a makeshift life raft all at once.
If the ship had kept drifting, every soul would have burned or drowned. Wedging it into the trees was the only non-zero chance of survival.
So the Eliza Battle comes to a shuddering halt above Kemp's Landing near modern-day Pennington, Alabama. She is suspended, wedged tightly among the massive trunks.
And the deep, freezing floodwaters are swirling violently just below her lower decks. The passengers, backed into corners by walls of fire, are forced to leap not onto land, but directly out into the freezing, pitch-black treetops.
The sheer physical feat of survival required here is staggering. You have men, women, and children in thin cotton nightclothes, barefoot, climbing over the railing of a raging bonfire.
Leaping into total darkness, blindly grabbing for icy, rough tree branches.
Having to haul their body weight up into the canopy while suspended over deadly rushing water.
And the casualty reports strongly suggest many people missed those desperate leaps. The fire illuminated a very small radius. Beyond that, the shadows from the canopy were impenetrable.
Jumping was a blind leap into a void.
Exactly. Those who missed the branches fell directly into the freezing current and were swept away, completely unseen by the people above.
And so the acute panic of the crash gives way to a much slower, much more agonizing horror. The ship is lodged in the trees, burning down to the waterline. The survivors are scattered.
Dozens clinging to icy branches. Others who fell managed to find partially burned cotton bales floating in the current, so they're half submerged in freezing water.
And the weather aggressively deteriorates. The cutting north winds intensify, and a hailstorm begins. Freezing rain and hail pelting the survivors in the trees.
We actually have a primary source eyewitness account from a survivor named Charles Mackay, which gives us a harrowing window into the auditory landscape of that night.
What did he say?
He described being trapped in the darkness, hearing nothing over the wind but, quote, prayers and lamentations.
Oh, wow. The isolation of that experience is profound. Straddling a rough branch in the pitch black, shivering violently. You can't see the person next to you, but you can hear them crying out.
And worst of all, you can hear the splashing below as people's strength finally gives out and they drop into the water, one by one.
And the most specific, tragic account from McKay's testimony, it involves a young mother.
Yes. McKay describes hearing the wailing cry of a young child dying in its mother's arms. The mother and baby had survived the fire and the leap into the trees.
But as the hours dragged on, the brutal cold took its toll. The sources state that after hours of exposure, her hands became too frozen. The text uses the word benumbed to physically maintain her grip.
Her hands stopped functioning.
The baby dropped from her arms, fell into the freezing swamp below, and was swallowed by the dark water.
We have to look at the physiological reality of extreme hypothermia here. The mother didn't let go out of normal muscular exhaustion.
Right, it's vascular.
Extreme cold and freezing wind trigger massive vasoconstriction. The human body forcefully pulls all warm blood away from the extremities to protect the core organs.
So the fingers lose blood flow, nerve endings go numb, muscles refuse to fire. It literally becomes physically impossible to command your hand to hold onto a branch or a child.
The body systematically shuts down peripheral functions to delay core death.
We hear about survival mode where adrenaline takes over, but adrenaline doesn't last for hours. How does the human mind even process watching a tragedy like that unfold right next to you in the dark?
Knowing you cannot reach out to help, because if you release your own grip, your frozen hands won't be able to grab the branch again.
Exactly. You die too.
In that state of profound distress, the human brain narrows its focus entirely to the primitive mechanics of survival: breathing, holding on.
So the trauma of what they heard and saw is just deferred.
Yes, the complex cognitive processes required for empathy or immediate grief are suppressed because the freezing brain lacks the metabolic surplus to process them.
The survivors were trapped in this freezing pitch-black hell for an excruciating 36 hours before rescue arrived. 36 hours.
The timeline is brutal. The initial adrenaline fades within the first hour. The next 5 hours are defined by violent, uncontrollable shivering as the body tries to generate heat.
Then dawn finally breaks, revealing the utter devastation. The smoking husk of the ship, empty branches where people had been clinging just hours before.
And daylight brings the crushing realization that nobody is coming to save them immediately. They endure an entire day exposed to the freezing wind, and then the true terror sets in.
The sun begins to set again, facing a second night in the trees.
Severe hypothermia begins to alter their brain chemistry. The shivering stops, which is actually a lethal clinical sign. Apathy sets in. Hallucinations begin.
The boundary between the waking nightmare and total physiological collapse blurs. Surviving the roaring fire was only the preamble. The true killer was the cold.
36 hours after the fire erupted, a rescue steamer called the Magnolia finally navigates down the flooded river.
Accompanied by local residents in skiffs and rowboats who had heard the rumors or seen the distant glow.
And when the Magnolia rounded the bend, they didn't find a ship. They found a smoking, waterlogged husk lodged in a frozen swamp.
And scattered through those frosted, leafless trees were dozens of rigid, hypothermic people barely clinging to life.
The logistics of the rescue operation were incredibly grim. The crew and the locals had to navigate small rowboats through the debris-filled swamp.
They had to physically pry traumatized, rigid passengers from the branches, lower them into the skiff, and simultaneously begin pulling the bodies of the dead from the freezing water.
The final statistics of the tragedy really highlight the brutality of the environment. An estimated 33 people died out of the roughly 100 on board,
making it the greatest maritime disaster in Tombigbee River history. But the haunting fact is that all of the casualties, every single recorded death, were attributed not to the fire, but to drowning or extreme cold exposure.
It's a profound irony. They successfully escaped the immediate threat of the flames. The fire didn't kill them, the river and the cold did.
The elements simply outlasted their endurance. Fire is fast and violent, but the freezing water is patient and inevitable.
Eventually, the burned-out hull of the Eliza Battle slipped from the trees, filled with floodwater, and sank 28 feet to the river bottom, where it remains to this day.
There's something deeply unsettling about knowing the physical skeleton of that machine is still down there right now, buried under the mud. It turns that stretch of the river into a submerged graveyard.
The 1850s saw a clear pattern of deadly river tragedies, but the Eliza Battle stands apart because of the sheer Gothic scale of the disaster, the environmental cruelty, and the agonizing duration of the suffering.
And an event of this magnitude leaves more than just physical wreckage. It leaves a massive psychic imprint on the culture.
It really does. The historical record concludes, but the folklore immediately takes root. The Eliza Battle crossed over into the dark folklore of southwestern Alabama.
Yeah, Catherine Tucker Wyndham famously documented this in her book, 13 Alabama Ghosts and Jeffrey, in a chapter called The Phantom Steamboat of the Tombigbee.
The legend states that on specific nights, dark, cold, windy winter nights that mirror the conditions of the disaster, the ship returns.
Sightings were reported from just north of Pennington down to Nanophalia, Locals and river workers claim to see the massive outline of the Eliza Battle on the water, fully engulfed in ghostly flames.
Rushing down the river channel just as she did in 1858, rivermen consider the phantom ship an ill omen.
A supernatural warning for ships still plying the river. And if we look at why this tragedy birthed a ghost story, it's fascinating.
It reveals so much about human psychology.
A luxurious, fiery runaway ship crashing into a frozen swamp is so visually striking, so unnatural, the human brain struggles to just call it a dry, historical record. The community has to mythologize it to process the trauma.
And the specific conditions of the sighting's cold, windy winter nights, it's environmental triggering. When the physical weather matches the night of the disaster, the cultural memory flares up.
A riverman navigating those bends in the dead of winter knows the history. Every strange howl of the wind, every flicker of a campfire through the trees can conjure the burning Eliza Battle.
The environment itself weaponizes the memory.
I honestly think the ghost story serves a practical purpose. Maybe it's a warning passed down through generations, the 19th century equivalent of an OSHA safety brief.
Wrapping the danger in a ghost story to ensure younger rivermen respect the weather. Beware the winter winds, respect the flooded banks, or you'll summon the Eliza Battle.
Yeah, it enforces safety protocols through visceral fear. It ensures the complacency that sank her, that normalization of deviance regarding sparks and cargo isn't repeated.
We started with a vessel that represented the absolute pinnacle of 1850s technology, a floating palace designed to insulate passengers from the wilderness.
And through a lethal, cascading combination of an unpredictable flood, a plunging winter temperature, a single spark, and the thermodynamics of raw cotton, that insulation was violently stripped away.
It is a profound narrative about our terrifying vulnerability against sudden shifts in the natural world. Our technology and hubris can be neutralized in hours by a shift in the wind.
So, next time you are standing near a body of water at night, whether it's the ocean or a quiet river cutting through the woods, look out into that pitch blackness. Think about the physical reality of water. A battlefield on land shows craters. A brain forest leaves charred stumps. But water holds absolutely no scars. It simply swallows history whole. It hides our greatest triumphs and our most agonizing horrors just beneath the surface, leaving us with nothing but the folklore of the flames. When a landscape witnesses something as horrific as the final hours of the Eliza Battle, does the land itself actually remember, projecting that trauma back at us on cold winter nights? Or is the human mind simply unable to accept that 33 terrified souls could freeze to death in the canopy of a swamp, vanish into the dark water, and simply be erased without a trace?